The Christmas Eve cookie tradition. The kitchen was alive with the sounds of Christmas Eve. Clattering bowls, spoons scraping against metal mixing bowls, and the steady hum of conversation. Grandma Rose stood at the center of it all, her flour-dusted hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades perfecting her craft. The kitchen, warmed by the oven and filled with the sweet scent of sugar and spices, had become the heart of the house. Every year, without fail, the family gathered here on Christmas Eve to bake cookies together, a tradition that had begun long before Grandma Rose took over the kitchen. "Mom, where's the vanilla extract?" Beth, Grandma Rose's daughter, asked as she shuffled through the cabinets, her voice laced with the need for everything to be perfect. Beth had inherited her mother's love for baking, but she was still learning to balance the joy of the process with her perfectionist tendencies. "Top shelf, dear," Grandma Rose said, her voice calm and steady, like the rhythm of the holiday itself. She glanced over at David, her son, who was busy trying to sneak a piece of cookie dough when he thought no one was looking. "David, how many times have I told you, wait until they're baked?" David, the eternal jokester, grinned as he popped the dough into his mouth anyway. "Sorry, Mom, couldn't help myself," he said, his eyes twinkling. "It's tradition." Grandma Rose shook her head, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Her adult children had changed in many ways over the years. Beth with her careful, methodical approach to everything, and David, still as playful and carefree as he'd been as a boy. But some things remained the same. Christmas Eve, for one, was as dependable as the rising sun. It had always been their night to come together as a family, to bake, laugh, and prepare for the holiday. "Grandma, can I mix the dough now?" Molly, Beth's daughter, piped up from her stool by the counter. At 11 years old, she was eager to be part of the tradition, her hands already reaching for the mixing bowl. "Wait for me," called James, David's teenage son, as he appeared from the living room, a little slower to join in, but still ready to help. He was 14, teetering on the edge of adulthood, but Grandma Rose had noticed that even as he grew older, he never missed a chance to be part of the Christmas Eve cookie tradition. "Of course, sweetheart," Grandma Rose said, smiling at Molly. "You can both help. Just be careful not to overmix the dough. We want light, fluffy cookies, not rocks." She winked at James, who rolled his eyes but smiled all the same. The family was all here now. Beth, David, and their children, along with Tom, Beth's husband, who leaned against the kitchen doorway, content to watch the chaos unfold with a camera in hand, ready to capture every moment. He always said his job was to document the memories, not interfere with the baking. Beth measured ingredients with precision, as if she were working in a laboratory instead of her mother's kitchen. Flour, sugar, and butter were all carefully portioned out into bowls, while the younger generation added sprinkles and decorations to their masterpieces, not caring much for precision, but rather for fun. "Mom, do you remember the year David mixed up salt with sugar?" Beth asked, her eyes flicking to her brother with an affectionate smirk. David groaned, his face already breaking into a grin. "How could I forget? You've never let me live it down." "Well, you did ruin an entire batch of cookies," Beth teased, playfully poking his arm as she passed by with a tray of freshly decorated sugar cookies. The laughter that followed filled the room with warmth, mingling with the sweet aroma of cinnamon and nutmeg. It was this, the laughter, the memories, the togetherness, that made the tradition so special. The cookies were important, yes, but they were just a vehicle for something much deeper. Every year, the act of baking brought them back together, no matter how far life had pulled them apart over the months. "Grandma, can we make the gingerbread men now?" Molly asked, her eyes bright with excitement. "Of course," Grandma Rose said, patting Molly's hand affectionately. "But remember, you need to keep them thick so they don't get too crunchy." Molly and James set to work, rolling out the dough with enthusiasm, while Beth and David watched, correcting and encouraging in equal measure. Grandma Rose, meanwhile, moved about the kitchen like a conductor, orchestrating the chaos with the grace of someone who had done this many times before. As the night went on, trays of cookies, gingerbread men, sugar cookies, shortbread, and thumbprint cookies filled every available surface, ready to be baked or decorated. The kitchen was a whirlwind of flour, sprinkles, and icing, but no one seemed to mind the mess. It was all part of the tradition. Beth wiped her brow and glanced at her mother. "We've been doing this for as long as I can remember," she said softly. "I don't think it would feel like Christmas without these cookies." Grandma Rose nodded, her eyes twinkling with the shared memories. "That's the beauty of it, isn't it? No matter what happens during the year, we always have this." For a moment, Beth and David exchanged a quiet glance, and the truth of their mother's words settled over them. Life had its ups and downs, and they didn't always agree or see each other as often as they'd like. But on Christmas Eve, they were here, together, carrying on the traditions that had been passed down through the generations. As the last tray of cookies went into the oven, Grandma Rose paused, a thoughtful look crossing her face. There was something else she hadn't yet shared with her family, a secret recipe that she had been saving for the right moment. She glanced at her children and grandchildren, all gathered around the kitchen, and felt a quiet stirring in her heart. But not yet. The time would come, soon enough. For now, they would laugh, bake, and enjoy the tradition they had built together over the years. The kitchen, already full of life, grew even more lively as the cookie baking officially began. Molly and James stood shoulder to shoulder at the counter, elbowing each other as they argued over who got to mix the next batch of dough. "I'm older. I should get to do it," James said, his voice half serious, half teasing as he reached for the mixing bowl. Molly wasn't having any of it. "You mixed the last batch. It's my turn," she insisted, her small hands gripping the wooden spoon tightly. Watching from the other side of the counter, Beth sighed softly, already measuring out the next set of ingredients with meticulous precision. "Kids, why don't you take turns? Molly, you can mix this batch, and James, you can roll out the next one." Molly grinned victoriously, while James shrugged, pretending not to care. "Fine, as long as I get to eat the first cookie," he muttered, though the sparkle in his eyes showed he was enjoying the back and forth as much as anyone. As they worked, flour flew into the air, sugar spilled onto the counter, and eggs cracked messily into bowls. The kitchen, once neat and organized, quickly descended into a chaotic mess, but no one seemed to mind. It was Christmas Eve, after all, and messes were part of the fun. On the other side of the room, David, always the jokester, snuck behind his mother and reached for a handful of cookie dough while everyone was distracted. Grandma Rose, however, had eyes like a hawk. She caught him just as his hand was about to swipe a chunk of dough from the bowl. "David," she said with mock sternness, "I told you, no dough until after the cookies are baked." David froze, his hand halfway to his mouth before grinning sheepishly. "Caught me again, huh, Mom?" "Every year," Grandma Rose replied, rolling her eyes but unable to suppress her smile. "You'd think you'd learn by now." "I like to keep you on your toes," David said, tossing the dough into his mouth and winking at his children, who were watching the exchange with amusement. Beth, ever the perfectionist, shook her head. "David, if you keep eating the dough, we won't have enough for all the cookies." David waved her off, still chewing. "Don't worry, Beth. We've got plenty." Molly and James giggled at their dad's antics, while Beth rolled her eyes and continued to work. "If it's up to you, we'll be out of cookies before they even hit the oven," she muttered. Despite her fussing, the scene brought a warm smile to Grandma Rose's face. She stood back, hands resting on her apron, watching as her family filled the kitchen with life. This was how it always went. Beth taking charge, David being playful, and the grandchildren adding their own layer of chaos. It was messy, loud, and imperfect. But to Grandma Rose, it was perfect in its own way. The kitchen had always been her domain, but as she grew older, she found herself stepping back more, letting her children and grandchildren take the lead. She didn't mind, though. There was something beautiful about watching them take ownership of the tradition she had nurtured for so many years. The baking itself wasn't the important part. It was the togetherness, the way the family came together, year after year, to create something more than just cookies. The sound of laughter echoed through the kitchen as the first trays of cookies went into the oven, filling the room with the comforting smell of butter and sugar. Molly and James, their earlier argument forgotten, now worked side by side to decorate the cookies that had already cooled, using bright red and green icing, sprinkles, and candy. "Look, Grandma," Molly said, holding up a cookie shaped like a Christmas tree, its branches covered in an explosion of colored sprinkles. "Isn't it pretty?" Grandma Rose chuckled softly. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. I think that's the most festive tree I've ever seen." Beside her, James was busy decorating his gingerbread man, though he had chosen to go for a more humorous approach. "Mine's got sunglasses," he said proudly, holding up his creation for the family to see. David leaned over to inspect it. "That's one cool gingerbread man," he said with a grin, ruffling his son's hair. As the decorating continued, the kitchen became a flurry of activity. Icing dripped off counters, sprinkles scattered across the floor, and no cookie looked remotely the same. Some were artfully decorated, with intricate patterns and perfectly placed sprinkles, while others were chaotic splashes of color and sugar. Beth, ever the perfectionist, tried to guide the children in keeping things neat, but even she couldn't help but smile as the mess grew. "It doesn't have to be perfect," she reminded herself quietly, echoing the advice her mother had given her so many times over the years. Grandma Rose noticed the shift in Beth's demeanor and gave her daughter a knowing smile. You know, Beth, she said softly, it's not about making perfect cookies. It never has been. Beth looked over at her mother, her brow furrowed slightly. I know, Mom. I just want everything to be right. Grandma Rose reached out and placed a hand on Beth's arm, her touch gentle and reassuring. It's already right. Look around. This is what it's all about. The cookies are just an excuse to bring us all together. Beth's expression softened as she followed her mother's gaze. Molly was giggling as she carefully applied more sprinkles to her already overloaded cookies, and James was teasing his father about the gingerbread man with sunglasses. Even David, with his usual playful attitude, had a rare look of contentment on his face as he watched his children and helped them decorate. Grandma Rose smiled warmly, watching the scene unfold. This was what she had always hoped for. Her family, together, sharing in the joy of the season. The cookies, the mess, the laughter. It was all part of the tradition that had evolved over the years. But at its core, it was about love, about being together. As the cookies baked in the oven, filling the house with the scent of cinnamon and ginger, the family gathered around the table, admiring their handiwork. Each cookie was different, each one a little piece of the night's memories, imperfect and unique. Stories from Christmases past started to spill out as they worked. Tales of holiday mishaps, childhood gifts, and the family's long-standing cookie tradition. They laughed about the time Beth had accidentally doubled the sugar, and the year David had burned the gingerbread men because he'd been too busy watching a football game. Grandma Rose listened quietly, her heart full as she watched her children and grandchildren bond over the cookies they had made together. The tradition had grown over the years, evolving with each new generation, but at its heart, it was still the same, about love, togetherness, and the joy of creating something beautiful, even if it wasn't perfect. As the last batch of cookies came out of the oven, golden brown and slightly misshapen, Grandma Rose felt a quiet contentment settle over her. The mess in the kitchen didn't matter, nor did the fact that some cookies were a little too crisp. What mattered was that they had shared this moment together, creating memories they would carry with them for years to come. The kitchen had finally quieted. The last batch of cookies was in the oven, and the family had retreated to the living room to relax, their laughter echoing softly through the house. Grandma Rose stood at the counter, her hands resting on the flour-dusted surface, her heart full as she listened to the familiar sounds of her family. Christmas Eve had always been like this, busy, noisy, filled with love. But tonight felt different, and she knew why. She took a deep breath and turned to look at the small tin box perched on the top shelf of the pantry. The box was old, the metal tarnished, its edges worn from years of handling. Inside, it held something precious, something she had kept close to her heart for decades. Now, standing in her warm kitchen, bathed in the glow of Christmas lights, Grandma Rose knew it was time to open it again. With careful hands, she pulled the box down from the shelf and carried it to the kitchen table. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the lid, revealing the neatly stacked recipe cards inside. Each one was handwritten, passed down from her mother and her mother's mother before her. These cards had weathered generations of family holidays, their ink slightly faded, but still legible. At the very bottom of the stack was the recipe she had been saving. A card, smaller than the others, its edges yellowed with time. The handwriting was familiar, her mother's delicate cursive, written in a soft, looping script. "Christmas heart cookies," it read at the top. Grandma Rose smiled wistfully as she traced the letters with her fingertips. She hadn't made these cookies in years. Her mother had given her this recipe with strict instructions. It was to be shared only when the family needed it most. Not when they were simply celebrating, but when they needed a reminder of what truly mattered. When love and unity needed to be rekindled. Rose's mother had taught her that these cookies weren't just for eating. They were for healing, for bringing people together when life had pulled them apart. And now, Grandma Rose felt it in her bones. The time had come to pass this recipe on to the next generation. She tucked the card into her apron pocket and made her way to the living room, where her family sat around the Christmas tree. Molly and James were flipping through old photo albums, giggling at the snapshots of Christmases past. Beth and David were chatting quietly, their voices blending with the crackling of the fire. "Mom, is everything okay?" Beth asked, noticing her mother lingering in the doorway. The curious look in her eyes told Grandma Rose that Beth sensed something important was about to happen. Grandma Rose nodded, her heart swelling with the love she felt for each of them. "Everyone, come back into the kitchen for a moment," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I have something I want to share with you." There was a murmur of curiosity as the family rose from their seats, exchanging puzzled glances. Tom, Beth's husband, raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as they followed Grandma Rose back into the kitchen. Once they were all gathered around the table, Grandma Rose reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, worn recipe card. She held it up, her smile warm and filled with the kind of quiet wisdom that only comes with age. "This," she began, "is a recipe my mother gave to me many years ago, and she gave it to me with a condition, that I was not to share it with anyone until the time was right." Beth leaned forward, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Grandma Rose looked around the table, her gaze resting on each of them, her children, her grandchildren, her family. "This recipe," she said, "is for Christmas heart cookies. They aren't just any cookies. They're special because they've been passed down through generations of our family, only to be made when we needed them most." David, ever the skeptic, leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "Needed them? What do you mean by that?" Grandma Rose chuckled softly. "I knew you'd ask that," she said, her eyes twinkling. "My mother told me that these cookies are a reminder of what really matters. They're meant to be baked when the family needs to be brought back together, when love and unity need to be renewed. They're not just about Christmas. They're about us." The room fell into a contemplative silence. Molly and James, usually filled with energy, sat still, their eyes fixed on their grandmother, sensing the weight of the moment. Beth was the first to break the silence. "Why now, Mom?" she asked gently. "Why are you sharing this with us now?" Grandma Rose's smile softened, and she glanced at the recipe card in her hand before speaking. "Because, Beth, I think it's time. We've had so many wonderful Christmases together, but I've seen how life has pulled us all in different directions. I see it in the little things, how busy you've become with work, how David's always on the go with his job, and how the kids are growing up so fast. It's easy to forget, in all the hustle and bustle, what's most important. David shifted slightly, his expression thoughtful. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, as if realizing that what his mother was saying was true. Grandma Rose continued, her voice filled with emotion. These cookies are more than just a recipe. They're a symbol of our family, of the love that's been passed down through the generations. They remind us that no matter how far apart we are, we're always connected, and I want to share that with all of you tonight. The room was quiet as her words settled over them. Even Beth, who usually kept her emotions tightly in check, blinked back the beginnings of tears. She had always focused on making things perfect. The perfect holiday, the perfect cookies. But in this moment, she realized that perfection wasn't the point. Being together, creating something as a family, that was what mattered. David cleared his throat, his usual playful tone absent. So, what do we need to do to make these special cookies? Grandma Rose smiled, feeling a surge of warmth at the way her son had softened. It's simple, she said, holding up the recipe card. The ingredients aren't complicated, just flour, sugar, butter, and a little bit of love. But the most important part is that we make them together. Molly and James leaned in closer, their curiosity piqued. Can we help, Grandma? Molly asked, her voice full of excitement. Of course, Grandma Rose said, her heart swelling with love for her grandchildren. In fact, I need all of you to help. That's what makes these cookies special. They're made with love from everyone. Beth took the card from her mother's hand, studying the neat handwriting. I remember Grandma's cookies, she said quietly, but I never knew they were this special. They were always special, Grandma Rose said, her voice thick with emotion. But I think now, more than ever, we need to remember why we do this. It's not about making the perfect cookies or following a recipe exactly. It's about being together, about sharing something that will last long after we've eaten the last cookie. David, who had been watching in quiet contemplation, finally nodded. Okay, Mom, let's do it. With that, the family gathered around the kitchen counter, their energy more focused now, more purposeful. Each person took on a role. Beth measured out the ingredients with her usual precision, while Molly and James helped Grandma Rose cut the dough into heart shapes. David, who usually joked his way through holiday traditions, was uncharacteristically serious as he rolled out the dough, his movements careful and deliberate. As they worked, the room filled with the familiar sounds of baking, the soft thud of dough being rolled out, the gentle clink of cookie cutters, the rhythmic hum of conversation. But there was something different in the air, something deeper than the usual holiday bustle. It was as if the act of making these cookies had become a quiet ritual, one that connected them not just to each other, but to the generations that had come before. When the cookies were finally ready, Grandma Rose placed them on a tray and slid them into the oven. The smell of butter and sugar filled the kitchen, mingling with the faint scent of cinnamon and vanilla from the earlier batches. The family gathered around the oven, watching the cookies bake in comfortable silence. After a few minutes, the cookies were golden brown, their heart shapes perfectly formed. Grandma Rose carefully removed them from the oven and set them on the counter to cool. They were simple, unadorned, no icing, no sprinkles, just golden heart-shaped cookies. "These are the Christmas heart cookies," Grandma Rose said softly, her eyes misting over. "They don't need to be fancy. They just need to be made with love." The family gathered around the table, each person taking a cookie from the tray. There was no rush to eat them, just a quiet, shared understanding of what they represented. As they bit into the cookies, their soft, buttery sweetness filling the room, Grandma Rose watched her family with a heart full of gratitude. This moment, she knew, would stay with them long after the cookies were gone. And in the years to come, when they gathered around this same kitchen, they would remember the night they made the Christmas heart cookies together, the night they were reminded of the love that bound them as a family. After Grandma Rose's heartfelt revelation, the atmosphere in the kitchen shifted. There was a newfound sense of purpose, an energy that wasn't about baking the perfect cookie, but about making something meaningful together. The family moved with a shared understanding that this moment was special, that the Christmas heart cookies weren't just any batch. They were a symbol of the love that bound them. Beth, usually meticulous and focused on getting everything just right, took a deep breath and smiled as she stood beside her mother. For once, she wasn't worried about measuring each ingredient to the exact gram or ensuring the dough was perfectly rolled out. Tonight, she would simply enjoy the process. "All right," Grandma Rose said with a smile. "Let's make these cookies." Molly, wide-eyed with excitement, jumped up to help. "Grandma, can I cut out the hearts?" she asked, already reaching for the cookie cutters. "Of course, sweetheart," Grandma Rose replied, her voice warm with affection. "But remember, the dough needs to be thick enough, or the cookies won't bake properly." Molly nodded eagerly and began rolling out the dough, her small hands carefully pressing the cookie cutter into the soft, buttery mixture. As she worked, James joined her, grabbing the icing from the counter. "I'm going to make mine look like Christmas trees," he announced, despite the fact that they were heart-shaped cookies. Molly giggled, shaking her head at her brother's antics. "Hearts don't look like trees, silly." "Watch me," James said with a grin, as he carefully piped green icing in the shape of a Christmas tree onto the heart-shaped cookie, determined to add his own creative spin to the tradition. Across the kitchen, David and Beth stood side by side, mixing the next batch of dough. There was a comfortable silence between them, the kind that only siblings who had grown up together could share. The usual teasing and light competition between them faded, replaced with a quiet nostalgia for all the Christmases they had spent in this very kitchen, doing this very thing. "Remember when we used to fight over who got to crack the eggs?" Beth asked, her voice soft with a hint of a smile. David chuckled. "Yeah, and I was terrible at it. You always ended up doing it anyway." "Well, at least you admit it," Beth teased, nudging him with her elbow. But her tone was lighter than usual, her mind not on perfection, but on the joy of being here with her family. Tom, who usually stayed on the sidelines during these holiday traditions, found himself rolling dough beside David, his laughter filling the room as he struggled to keep the rolling pin steady. "I think my cookies are going to be more like Christmas blobs," he said, eyeing the misshapen hearts in front of him. Perfect blobs, Grandma Rose replied with a wink, as long as they're made with love. As the trays of heart-shaped cookies went into the oven, the kitchen filled with the smell of butter and sugar once more. But this time, it wasn't just the scent of cookies baking. It was the smell of tradition, of memories being created and passed down. The first batch of cookies came out of the oven golden and slightly uneven. Some were too thick, others a little too thin, and a few had browned more than they should have. But no one seemed to mind. The imperfections were part of the charm. Molly and James took charge of decorating, though their styles couldn't have been more different. Molly focused on careful, even layers of icing, making sure each cookie looked as neat as possible. James, on the other hand, went wild with red and green icing, turning the simple heart shapes into miniature works of holiday art. Some a little chaotic, but all bursting with personality. "Look at mine!" James exclaimed, holding up a cookie that looked more like a Jackson Pollock painting than a Christmas heart. David leaned over and inspected it, laughing. "I think you missed a spot." James grinned. "It's called artistic freedom, Dad." Beth, meanwhile, was frosting her own cookies, and for once, she wasn't fretting over whether the icing was perfectly even. Instead, she looked around the kitchen, taking in the sight of her family laughing, decorating, and talking all at once. She smiled to herself, feeling lighter than she had in years. Her mother had been right. This wasn't about getting everything right. It was about being together, about making memories, even if they were a little messy. Tom finished rolling out another batch of dough, glancing at his wife with a grin. "Well, what do you think? I'm not half bad at this, huh?" Beth laughed softly. "Not bad at all," she said, though her smile was more about the joy of the moment than the quality of his cookies. As the cookies piled up on the cooling racks, the family gathered around the table, continuing to decorate and share stories from Christmases past. David told the kids about the time he had accidentally switched the salt for the sugar in one of the recipes, and they all groaned and laughed at the memory. Beth reminisced about the year the power had gone out, and they had made cookies by candlelight. Grandma Rose chimed in with stories of her own childhood Christmases, her eyes twinkling as she recounted the simpler times when everything felt magical because they had each other. The kitchen was filled with laughter, conversation, and the occasional clatter of cookie cutters hitting the counter. It was the kind of joyful chaos that made Grandma Rose's heart swell with pride. This messy, imperfect, love-filled moment was exactly what she had hoped for when she decided to share the Christmas heart cookie recipe. As the evening wore on and the last of the cookies came out of the oven, Grandma Rose stood back, watching her family in harmony. Her children, her grandchildren, even Tom, all working together, laughing, and making memories. It wasn't perfect, and that was the best part of all. Grandma Rose wiped a tear from her eye, not out of sadness, but out of the deep, overwhelming love she felt for her family. She had passed down something more than just a recipe. She had passed down a piece of her heart, and as she looked around the room, she knew that they would carry this tradition forward, long after she was gone. The cookies may have been a little uneven, but the love they had poured into them was as perfect as it could be. Christmas morning dawned softly, the first light of day filtering through the windows, casting a warm glow across the snow-covered landscape outside. The house was still quiet, the usual bustle of the kitchen temporarily at rest. But the scent of the Christmas heart cookies still lingered in the air, mingling with the smell of fresh pine from the Christmas tree. In the living room, the family gathered around the tree, their eyes sparkling with anticipation, but also with the quiet contentment that only a Christmas morning could bring. Molly and James sat at the foot of the tree, their excitement barely contained as they peeked at the presents waiting to be opened. Before anyone could dive into the gifts, Grandma Rose appeared from the kitchen, carrying a plate of the Christmas heart cookies. They were beautifully arranged, the golden hearts glowing in the soft morning light, and nestled among them was a folded note. She set the plate down on the coffee table, smiling at her family as they gathered around. "Before we start with the presents, I have something to share," she said gently. Beth, David, Tom, and the kids looked at her with curiosity as she unfolded the note and began to read aloud. "To my family, may we always remember that the best gifts are the ones we make together. Merry Christmas, with love, Grandma Rose." For a moment, there was a hushed stillness in the room as her words sank in. The family looked at each other, each of them realizing that the heart-shaped cookies they had baked the night before were more than just a sweet treat. They had become something far more meaningful. Beth picked up one of the cookies, her eyes soft with emotion. "Mom, these cookies, they're more than just a recipe, aren't they?" Grandma Rose smiled, her heart full. "Yes," she said softly. "It's not about the recipe itself. It's about the time we spent together, making them with love. That's the real gift." David, who had always been quick with a joke, was quiet now, his eyes thoughtful as he reached for a cookie of his own. "You're right, Mom," he said, his voice uncharacteristically serious. "Last night, baking those cookies, it was special. I don't think I'll ever forget it." Molly and James eagerly took cookies from the plate, biting into them with wide smiles. "They taste even better today," James exclaimed. Tom, always the observer, wrapped an arm around Beth's shoulders as he spoke softly. "I think we've started a new tradition," he said, his voice warm with the realization of how much the night before had meant to them all. Grandma Rose beamed with pride. "That's the idea," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "The Christmas heart cookies are something we can carry with us, year after year. It's a reminder that, no matter what, we always have each other." As the family sat together, the plate of cookies gradually disappearing, they didn't rush to open the gifts. Instead, they shared stories from Christmases past, laughing and reminiscing about the traditions that had brought them here. There was a sense of peace in the room, a kind of quiet joy that comes from knowing that the best moments are the ones shared with the people you love. The fire crackled softly in the background, casting a gentle warmth over the room as they made plans to bake the Christmas heart cookies again next year. And as they talked, Grandma Rose looked around at her family, her children, her grandchildren, all gathered together, and her heart swelled with love and gratitude. This, she thought, was the greatest gift of all.